All right, everybody, buckle up, because we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today. The Lee Street Massacre. It's a tragic event that's been kind of swept under the rug in a lot of history books, but we need to understand it.
It's definitely a tough subject. But you know what they say? Those who can't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And this is one part of history we definitely don't want to see again.
Absolutely. And I bet some of you listening are thinking, the Lee Street Massacre, what's that? And honestly, that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to uncover a story that almost got lost to time.
It's like a hidden chapter that we got to bring to light.
Exactly. To really grasp the weight of what happened, we got to set the scene first. So we're talking early 1900s, the Jim Crow era.
Right. Picture a world where just because of your skin color, you couldn't drink from the same water fountain or sit in the same part of a bus, couldn't even vote. That was the reality for Black folks back then. And lynchings. Tragically, they were a common way to terrorize Black communities and enforce this whole messed up system.
It's chilling to think about. Living with that constant fear, knowing that just an accusation, even a lie, could get you killed.
That's the backdrop against which the Lee Street Massacre happened. It all went down in specific city-state. And while there was a specific event that kind of set things off, we can't forget this was the boiling point of decades of racial tension.
It's like all that pressure finally erupted.
Exactly. Our sources point to triggering event as the spark that lit the fuse.
And that event was definitely significant, but it's crucial to see it as part of this larger pattern of oppression that had been weighing down Black communities for generations.
You got it. To just focus on that one event would be like looking at a single crack in a dam and ignoring the whole flood about to break through.
So let's get into the heart of it. What actually went down on Lee Street?
Well, driven by rumors and deep-seated prejudice, a white mob stormed into the predominantly Black neighborhood on Lee Street. And this wasn't just about targeting individuals. It was about sending a message of fear and control to the entire Black community.
And from what I've read, the sources don't shy away from describing the brutality. Armed mobs, torches homes, set on fire, businesses looted. It's tough to even imagine the level of violence that took place.
It was a nightmare. And what makes it even more horrifying is that the people who were supposed to protect citizens, the local law enforcement, were often on the side of the mob.
It's mind-boggling. Instead of upholding the law, they either joined in the violence or just looked the other way. It makes you wonder, where was the justice in all of this?
And the lack of justice, that's just the tip of the iceberg. What makes this whole thing even more tragic is the deliberate attempt to erase it from history. Like, people just wanted to pretend it never happened.
That's like a double whammy. First, the violence itself, and then trying to bury it and act like it never even occurred. It really makes you think, how many other stories like this have been silenced? How many voices have been lost?
It's a sobering thought, but thankfully there are folks out there, dedicated historians, community leaders, activists, who are working tirelessly to reclaim these lost narratives.
They're the real heroes. Piecing together the fragments of evidence, collecting oral histories, painstakingly reconstructing the truth of what happened on Lee Street, and in so many other places where similar tragedies occurred.
Absolutely. They're doing the heavy lifting, reminding us that forgetting the past makes us vulnerable to repeating it.
Which brings us to a crucial question for our listeners. What can we learn from the Lee Street Massacre? And how can we apply those lessons to create a more just and equitable society today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? For me, it starts with awareness. By learning about these events, acknowledging the suffering of those who came before us, we become more sensitive to the subtle and not-so-subtle forms of injustice that still exist today.
It's like developing a sharper vision, being able to spot those echoes of the past and the present. How does trauma from events like the Lee Street Massacre show up in communities today?
That's a powerful question, and it's one we need to wrestle with, honestly. We see those echoes in racial profiling and the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, and in the persistent socioeconomic disparities that plague our communities.
So if we're seeing these echoes, these patterns, what does that tell us about how far we've really come as a society? Have we actually moved past the horrors of the Jim Crow era?
It's tempting to think we've come a long way, and in some ways we have. But the Lee Street Massacre serves as a stark reminder that the fight for equality is far from over. The roots of prejudice and discrimination are still there, and they can easily grow back if we're not careful.
It's like we're tending a garden, constantly pulling out the weeds, the toxic ideas that can choke the life out of a just and equitable society.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the fact that this work takes constant effort, constant vigilance. We can't afford to get complacent or think that the battles of the past have won the victories of the future.
So what can we do as individuals to make sure we're not just passively watching history repeat itself? How do we become active gardeners in this fight for a better world?
It starts with education. We need to understand the historical context of racial injustice and how it still affects our society today. It's not enough to just say racism is bad. We need to understand the systems, the policies, the deeply held beliefs that keep it going.
So it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding the why behind them, but connecting the dots between the past and the present.
Exactly. And that understanding needs to lead to action. We need to challenge our own biases, have those uncomfortable conversations with our friends and family, and be willing to listen and learn from those who have different experiences than our own.
It sounds like a lot of work, but it's clear we can't afford to just sit this one out.
Absolutely. And remember, we don't have to do it alone. There are tons of organizations and individuals out there already doing the work, fighting for social justice, advocating for policy changes, providing legal aid, empowering marginalized communities. We can join them, support their efforts, amplify their voices.
It's about finding our place in this collective fight, contributing what we can, no matter how big or small.
You got it. And remember, even small acts of courage, small acts of defiance can have a ripple effect. Think about the individuals who spoke out against the Lee Street Massacre, even when it put their own lives at risk. Their actions may have seemed small at the time, but they planted the seeds for future generations to keep fighting for justice.
It's a reminder that every voice matters. Every action counts.
Absolutely. The Lee Street Massacre may be a dark chapter in our history, but it can also serve as a powerful motivator for change. It can remind us of what we stand to lose if we stay silent and what we can achieve if we stand together against injustice.
It's been a heavy conversation, for sure. But as we wrap up this deep dive into the Lee Street Massacre, I'm actually left with a sense of hope, even with all the tragedy.
I know what you mean. It really speaks to the resilience of the human spirit that even after facing such horrific violence and oppression, the Black community didn't just give up. They rebuilt their lives, they organized for change, and they kept fighting for justice.
That's what I find so inspiring. Despite all the trauma they persevered, they refused to let hate win.
Exactly. And that kind of unwavering determination should be a lesson for all of us today. It's a reminder that the fight for equality, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's one that requires all of us to run.
So as we bring this episode to a close, let's turn our attention to the present. What are some concrete steps our listeners can take to continue this fight for justice?
There are so many ways to get involved, no matter who you are or what resources you have. It can start with something as simple as educating yourself. Read books, articles about the history of racial injustice in America, watch documentaries, films that shine a light on these issues, and most importantly, listen to the voices of those who've experienced racism firsthand.
Education is definitely key, but it's just the beginning, right? How do we take that knowledge and turn it into action?
That's where things get really interesting. Once you've educated yourself, you'll start to see opportunities for action everywhere. It could be as simple as calling out a racist joke or a microaggression when you hear one. It could be supporting organizations that are fighting racial injustice in your community or nationally.
So it's about finding those moments, big or small, where we can make a difference.
Exactly. And remember, those moments don't always have to be these big, grand gestures. Sometimes the most powerful actions are the quiet, consistent ones, like having tough conversations with family and friends, challenging their biases, helping them see the world through a more empathetic lens.
It sounds like this work requires us to be brave, to step outside our comfort zones.
It does. But remember, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting despite your fear. And the more we practice courage, the easier it gets.
It's a muscle we got to keep working out.
Exactly. And by working out that muscle, by consistently choosing to challenge injustice, we honor the legacy of those who fought for equality before us. People like those who lived through the Lee Street Massacre, who dared to dream of a better world and took action to make it happen.
Their struggles, their sacrifices, they paved the way for us. Now it's our turn to pick up the torch.
It's our responsibility to make sure their stories aren't forgotten and that the fight for justice keeps going. The Lee Street Massacre may be a painful reminder of our past, but it can also be a beacon of hope for a brighter future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this history, to engage with your communities, and to use your voices and actions to create a world where events like the Lee Street Massacre never happen again.
Let's remember, the fight for justice is a journey, and every step we take, no matter how small, brings us closer to a more equitable and compassionate world.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.